Hello everybody, it's Mr. Second Amendment, and today I'm doing a video on spare parts, and I'll just tell you up front right away before we get into it, I want to make it a quick video, but I think spare parts are the most underrated thing when it comes to collecting guns. You can have your historical gun collector, your competition shooter, your heavy usage shooter, maybe the guy who just has a bunch of guns he's going to pass to his kids, whatever the case. I think spare parts are one of the most underrated things ever. And that's because if one little tiny part breaks, it has a large potential to make the whole weapon system go down. One little tiny part is all it takes to either get broken or lost or whatever, and all of a sudden that whole weapon system is worthless. So for those of you who want to keep your guns running over the many years and decades, or pass them down to your family so they can also enjoy them and shoot them, I would highly recommend that you get spare parts. And everyone talks about, oh, you need to have a whole stockpile of guns, or you need the stockpile ammo, you need the stockpile magazines. I agree with all that to a large extent, but I also think one thing that most people don't talk about is spare parts. So let's get into it. This is just an example. I pulled out one of my trays here, and I have spare parts for every gun I own. Some guns I have very minimal spare parts. Other guns like my AR-15, my 1911, I have a lot of spare parts because those are my heavy usage guns, my defensive guns. If there were ever some type of natural disaster or need for serious protection for whatever reason, those are my guns I go to. So I definitely put more of my money and time into getting spare parts for those. Moving on, here's my tray. As you can see, it's packed in grease. And for those who don't know, I think it's pretty obvious, but those who don't know, that's to prevent rust. Okay, so these are packed in grease. Most of it is sealed up in bags. Some of it is just packed in grease and out in the open. And the whole reason why I do that is in case maybe the house where they get flooded or whatever is somehow it's exposed to the moisture. Maybe it's a humid environment. Maybe I'm on the eastern coast, so all my air is really humid out there. I remember what that was like. So at the end of the day, you just want to keep that metal away from the moisture. And if it means putting a physical barrier on the metal, such as grease, I highly recommend that. Moving on, and before I get on, I just want to say this one big point is a invalid or an unserviceable or a broken spare part is no spare part. Okay, so don't knowingly stock away spare parts that you know are worn down or you know are broken or unserviceable. You want to get parts that you know are brand new or that they're extremely functional. A whole collection of spare parts that are just broken or worn down, or maybe you have bolts that are out of headspace or whatever, that's just not worth having, honestly. You want to make sure that if you ever need, in the real event that you ever need to grab any of your spare parts to keep a weapon system running, it's probably an event where you can't really afford to have a broken spare part. So that's a pretty big point. I want to move from that. You got things like, this is a Mossberg 500 bolt, so that's for my 590 in case I need it. That's kind of the advantage of a 590A1 is it uses 500 parts. Moving on, we got some 1911 springs. For those of you who are Mosin owners or shooters, you'll realize these are Mosin bolt parts. 1911 parts are hiding spare 1911 barrel, all of it packed in grease, of course. One of my favorite ways to do it is pack it in grease or oil, depending on the parts. We're going to get into that, and vacuum seal it. That is the absolute best thing you can do, in my opinion. Moving on, looks like we got some M1 Garand parts hiding here, all packed in grease, of course. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with packing it in grease. If you ever had to use it or put it into action or replace parts on your weapon system with the grease-packed parts, all you would have to do is spray off or clean off the grease, and you're good to go. Got feed lever for 500. These are just examples of spare parts, and I think you should focus on things like extractors, ejectors, springs, firing pins, bolts, things that just by nature will eventually need to be replaced. People forget that things such as barrels, bolts, extractors, firing pins, springs, those are all disposable items. Those are all items that need to be replaced within the service life of virtually any gun you can imagine. At some point, you're going to have to replace it. And that's just how it is. It's a mechanical object. For you AR guys out there, you know what all this is. These are AR spare parts. You'll notice in the AR parts, I don't have any grease in here. It's all oil. And especially, let me pull this guy out. You can see, for those of you who are not familiar, a lot of these AR parts, these little tiny detents and stuff, very, very small. So in my opinion, it's not going to make, let me zoom in, there you go. It's not going to make a whole lot of sense to pack that in grease because these little springs and detents are going to get lost. So I pack it in a thin viscosity oil such as Rem Oil, WD-40, something of that nature. I've got some extra springs, got some extra detents. Elsewhere I have fire and control group and a bunch of other stuff. So, you know, it's a good idea for the very small parts to pack them in oil. For the larger stuff, such as those M1 parts, or like right here, I got an M1 bolt or that 500 bolt, you're going to want to pack that in grease. Now, some of these parts are more critical than others. I have an extra M1 Garand butt plate, but at the end of the day, the rifle is going to function without it. So I'm just putting my whole spare parts collection aside. You can also, if you have access to MREs or you've got some of those lying around, the beverage bag, one of the best things you can do. It's a very heavy duty plastic, much tougher and thicker than Ziplocs, and that fits in really nice, keeps it nice and protected. Some of these parts I haven't got around the vacuum sealing or bagging yet, such as the Mosin bolt parts here. Moving on, I also have, this is actually one of my favorite ways to store a AR-15 bolt if you don't have access to vacuum sealing. This is a completed bolt ready to go. It's all put together. It's a completed bolt carrier group, and this is basically packed in grease, thrown in a beverage bag, and taped up with 100-mile-an-hour duct tape there. And if I needed it, I just slice open the bag, take the bolt out of it, spray it down, get all the grease off of it, and just throw it in the gun, and I'm ready to go. So one of my favorite ways to do that. Now, what should we be using? Like I said, WD-40 Rem Oil for the smaller parts. For all the larger parts, everything you see here, I did it with SuperTech. This stuff is one of many different options you can choose from. Buy it at Walmart for like $2 a tube. It's just the thick grease stuff. Throw an AR brush or a toothbrush or a spoon in there, whatever you want, and you dig it out and just coat all the parts. Good to go. Along with the spare parts, there's another thing I got to talk about, and that is armorer's tools. Okay, especially if you own military pattern guns like a 1911, AR-15, things like that that are military guns. Usually there's a set of military or armorer's tools out there. This is an M1 Garand specific tool. I've also got the M3 combo tool, a bunch of other M1 tools to the side. This is a Mosin teardrop tool. It's a tool, and it's also a firing pin protrusion guide. And I also have this AR-15 wrench and some other AR tools. It's always a good idea, in my opinion. I mean, you can have the rifle, you can have the properly prepared spare parts, but if you have no way of putting them in professionally or just making sure you get the job done, then they also become worthless. So I would urge you to get the spare parts, pack them correctly so that they can survive long-term storage, and then I would also get the armorer's tools to make sure that you have a way of installing them. And again, that's why I kind of lean towards military pattern firearms, is because there's a huge wealth of knowledge out there. One of which, kind of rolling into my next point, is you should also have documentation. You should also have manuals. You should also have basically, in the event that I'm not around or I'm not alive, maybe it's long after I'm gone and my family has all these guns they inherited, but they don't really know how they work, and maybe they have a need for using those guns, but they don't know how to work them. If you stock away manuals, vacuum seal them, pack them away so they don't get, deteriorated over time. It's a good idea to have the manuals so you can, without even being there, you can teach people, or basically people can teach themselves how to actually operate, take apart, clean, load these guns. So that's just kind of an idea there. I think this video is kind of long overdue. And the reason why I did it is because, everyone, like I said, everyone makes an emphasis on guns and ammo and magazines and this and that, but it seems like no one's ever really talking about spare parts. And that's kind of unfortunate, given how, like I said, one little tiny part is all it takes and that whole weapon system is down. And in some type of event, maybe you're a prepper, maybe you just want to make sure your family's protected during a natural disaster. I mean, if it's Hurricane Katrina and you're sitting there for weeks on end without law enforcement, no rule of law, there's nothing, you're just by yourself, and one little part on your gun fails, all of a sudden you can't protect yourself and your family anymore. So, you have to become your own armor. You have to become the guy who's going to fix it. You can't really send off your gun to the factory or have a gunsmith look at it during something like that. So again, there's many reasons why. Hopefully I've demonstrated the many reasons why you should have a stock of spare parts for every gun you own. and also the tools, all the armorer's tools or the gun specific tools that are going to be needed for that gun. I'm really big fan of tools that are multi-tools like this, where there's many different, pretty much every major function on an AR-15 you can accomplish with even just a basic military style armorer's wrench like such. And also lastly, my last point is documentation, manuals, training manuals, things of that nature. Hopefully this video has helped out somebody, made you think about things that maybe you weren't thinking about before, and that's okay. That's why we're here. And thanks for watching. Please comment for questions.